Shall we go ahead and talk about OSHA?
We
Our
shall.
second favorite topic?
That sounds great to me. Awesome. No, that's perfect. Great segue. Really looking at the state of OSHA. All right. And we'll move into OSHA here. Really the big thing with OSHA is we're going to go over, reviewing the current state of OSHA. All right. What you need to know, just like we talked about with HIPAA, what you need to know based on what we've seen over the last few years. Now, OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It was enacted in 1970. Congress created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to ensure safe and healthful work conditions for workers by setting and enforcing standards and by providing training, outreach, education, and assistance. All right, believe it or not, even though OSHA does tend to get a bad name for itself, it's actually meant for good. And it was created and initiated to create safe working conditions while setting standards for best practices. The OSHA Act was actually originally drafted in response to the public outcry in the 60s and 70s against rising injuries and death rates on the job. Now, OSHA's regulations apply to all private sector companies, including healthcare organizations like yourself, with the main goal of reducing injuries, illness, and deaths in the workplace. Now, statistics, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, deaths in the workplace have been reduced by 50%. And work-related illnesses and injuries are down 40% since the establishment of OSHA. At the end of the day, it's ultimately accomplishing what it was set out to do. Okay. Now, just like we talked about for OSHA, it's important to understand what those triggers are for an OSHA investigation. You'll notice on the slide, there are 3 investigation triggers for OSHA. You have a reaction to a complaint or an incident and programmed inspections. All right, we're going to drill a little bit deeper into each of these over the next couple of minutes. But when we talk about enforcement, you're also going to see that OSHA has recently painted a target on healthcare's back. Before we do that, I just want to take a brief second here to give you an idea as to the 2022 headlines that you should be aware of. Okay. Now, diving a little bit deeper into those headlines. First revolves around whistleblower complaints, which we're going to have an example here in a little bit, but those have increased by 31%. Now you might be asking, what is this? It is a complaint filed about your organization by a visitor, patient, or employee. The reason why this number has increased is because the public simply knows that OSHA is going to come out and investigate. All right. Now, the second one, when we speak about investigations, they're hiring more investigators, looking to increase their budget by 14.7%. So actually going to go from $612 million in fiscal year 2022 to this year, $701 million in 2023. All right. The government is not really, the big thing here is that it's not fleeting. Their program, they actually 37% of that budget increase is slated specifically for enforcement. All right. Now, along with that proposed budget and hiring efforts from OSHA, we've continued to see a change in regulatory standards related to COVID-19, including the introduction of a new temporary enforcement standard, which is planned to become a permanent safety standard for the healthcare industry later this year or early next year. All right. Now, the last two, OSHA has expressed a renewed focus on enforcing whistleblower protection and hazardous chemical exposure, which of course specifically are very relevant to the healthcare industry. All right. And then the final thing I want you to be aware of, it's very important, is that OSHA brought on a new head of OSHA. His name's Doug Parker, and he was the former head of OSHA, California OSHA, and being close to Arizona, right? And the really brings a more stringent and aggressive approach, compared to his predecessors. All right. And we're certainly expecting that that's going to be a trend as he moves into the new head of OSHA role. Now, speaking of Doug Parker, here's a recent quote from him, really with a call to action for OSHA, employers, and other stakeholders to redouble collective efforts to make our nation's workplace safer. So it reads, today's announcement by the Bureau of Labor Statistics of 1 year increase of nearly 9% in fatal work injuries serves as a call to action for OSHA, employers, and other stakeholders to redouble our collective efforts. All right, so really an important quote from Doug Parker. Now, interesting slide here. You can see that whistleblower complaints have been on a steady incline, with OSHA receiving more than 6,900 complaints as of 2022. All right. Now, simply put, like we talked about earlier, the reason we're seeing that increase is obviously the public understands that when a complaint is filed, OSHA is going to take their own due diligence and that initiative to investigate. Now, really want to look into the two different ways OSHA can inspect your organization. All right, we have planned or programmed and unprogrammed. Planned programmed inspections fall under a proactive approach where OSHA enforcement is visiting higher hazard industries. All right, or in other words, workplaces with higher instances of severe injury or illness. Because there are more instances of this, these establishments are exposed to the National Emphasis Program, which was initially created to initiate those proactive investigations. All right, and you're going to see in the next slide that healthcare fits into this category specifically of a high hazard industry, and therefore are more likely to be chosen by OSHA for a programmed inspection. All right, now the next way that you can be investigated is during an unplanned or unprogrammed inspection. This means on a reactive base, right? It's reactive, likely based on an incident, injury, or illness. Also, final big takeaway here is the total number of inspections for 2021. Really, as we move forward, and we're gathering that data for 2022. Just in 1 year, like you can see here on the screen, OSHA conducted nearly 25,000 investigations. 58.1% were unprogrammed. And that's really why the government, like we talked about, is going to continue to drill and they're going to continue to make money. And in this way, it's definitely become a revenue stream for them, considering the disparity between practices that were compliant and then the ones that were not. Now, we talked about some data on the previous slide and really diving into this. So you'll see here, this is some data on injury and illness cases pertaining to different employer sectors over the last 3 years. Interesting to note, all private industry sectors decreased or remained the same, except for healthcare and social assistance, which increased 40.1% in 2020, actually totaling 36.8% for the last 3 years. All right, this is largely due, when we look at this, largely due to the pandemic, but it's important to note that this data is going to show who the government is choosing to proactively audit. They're going to spend more time in those sectors that are seeing higher injury and illness rates, which at this point is very clear. It really paints a huge target on the healthcare industry's back specifically. Now, we don't have to spend too much time here, but speaking of investigation, we talk about that increased in budget. All right, you can see here with that graph that 37%, as we talked about, is slated specifically for enforcement. Now, I don't want to bore you by going through each type of violation, but it's important to know that these penalties are subject to annual adjustments for inflation, jumping 6.2% from 2021 to 2022. Two things to take away here. One, it just goes to show that OSHA and OSHA enforcement is a top priority of the government. And two, the penalty amounts are simply just nothing to joke about. All right, in terms of percentage increases, we actually saw a 6.2% increase from 2021 to 2022, which is the largest increase in base penalty amount since the yearly increases started. All right. Now, enough with the bad news. All right. Here's really a great thing. And it was extended an olive branch to you, the government did, with their good faith penalty reduction program. A penalty reduction is permitted in recognition of an employer's effort to implement an effective safety and health management system in the workplace. In order to qualify for this reduction, the employer's safety and health management system must document a few things: appropriate management commitment and employee involvement, worksite analysis for the purpose of hazard identification, hazard prevention and control measures, and then lastly, safety and health training. All right. Now, when we look into specifically, how the government defines being compliant, you're going to see that there's a trend from what we saw with HIPAA and moving into OSHA, really looking at how the government defines being compliant in their eyes. And that definition is the same as what you saw with HIPAA. It's that documented proof that there's a culture of compliance within your organization. Really, that culture of safety and health is what's going to protect your employees. But the documentation is obviously what's going to protect the practice in the event of an investigation. And a lot of times, especially with OSHA, it can be confusing, like we talked about, as to what that documentation needs to look like. All right. Now, just because there really isn't the most abundant amount of guidance as to what that needs to look like. And that's why we see independent practices become so vulnerable in these OSHA fines as well. Now, that's really what requires each of you as an employer, but I want to simplify through puzzle pictures. All right, so it's a dense chart there, but when we look at the puzzle pictures, we're going to go through specifically what this looks like, what those puzzle pieces look like, and then what needs to be provided in the case of an OSHA investigation. All right. Now, just like we talked for HIPAA, the easiest way to think about compliance, HIPAA and OSHA, think of it like taxes, like we talked about earlier. All right. That really stays the same. That's standard. The government's going to, typically doesn't see that abundance of compliance, simply put, because they don't see that documentation in place. They treat that lack of documentation to be non-compliant. All right. Now, really want to start off with the first step in OSHA compliance, the facility risk assessment. Now, the important thing with the facility risk assessment is it's going to be an evaluation that sets the baseline for your compliance program. Really, what they're asking you to do is identify the different hazards that can affect your office within OSHA's 7 core elements. When hazards are identified, you should also be documenting what controls are in place to limit exposure, employees' exposure to injury or illness. All right. Now, for medical practices, it can be hard to know what controls you need and currently don't have. Simply put, if you knew about them, you would probably already have implemented safeguards, or at the very least, you'd have a plan to mitigate those vulnerabilities. All right. Now, as you guys doing a million different things, it can be hard to know what is considered best OSHA practices, okay, for a medical provider. Now, that's just really where we see the facility risk assessment present a problem. Small, mid-sized practice environment, you're not an OSHA expert, right? You don't have the time, energy, or knowledge to make sure that it's getting done correctly or accurately or thoroughly, right? But it still needs to get done one way or another because it is required. All right, so I definitely want to emphasize the importance of that enough. Now, as we move forward, we have hazard mitigation, right? Once you identify those risks and hazards, the government wants you to mitigate those hazards. All right. Now, the really important thing, this process should be something that your employees are involved with. Part of their training should include that they're actively participating in hazard prevention and control. And if safety and health inspections should be performed regularly, hazard mitigations should be a regular thing for your practices employees as well. Now, moving forward, we talk about OSHA training. All right. OSHA training, OSHA is really very specific when it comes to training requirements. And this really starts as soon as each individual walks through the door. The most important thing in regards to training, I would like you to remember, is training must be specific to your workplace, also in a timely manner. So it's not just going to cut it by having an OSHA manual, right? That's not going to be sufficient enough. Employers have to address site-specific hazards, ensure employees understand what they're being trained on, and when they're performing those tasks that they have been trained on, they're doing so appropriately and safely. And if they are, it's okay to implement disciplinary actions for noncompliance. OSHA honestly advocates for these measures to be in place, and employees understand that. Now, like we talked about, not only biology-based, but does need to be site-specific. You'll see here, OSHA training is just one piece of that larger puzzle picture. We want to make sure that, I want to make sure that I overcome that misconception that you can just go through training every year, making you compliant, right? There are more pieces to that puzzle than just specifically training. Now, as we go forward, OSHA programs, policies, and forms, these are really important. Policies and procedures, they must be drafted specifically to the organization, really identifying how your organization addresses the safety and health of employees. Now, these are really vital in the case of an audit. Just like when we talk about policies and procedures for HIPAA, your programs, policies, and forms are going to be like those OSHA supporting tax documents, right? 1099s and W-2s. All right. We see a lot of practices go out, download general templates. In the case of an audit, templates have never been acceptable. All of those templated policies and procedures, all they're really doing there is really feeding that false sense of security. Now, we move into an OSHA manual, right? Most practices I deal with understand that term, right? What an OSHA manual looks like. But just like we saw with the HIPAA manuals, the government doesn't want that false sense of security, right? With compliance, it's really on the inside that matters. All right. And what they look for is just an easily accessible area for you to store your risk assessments, your policies and procedures, and then any other OSHA documents as necessary. It can be as in physical or electronic form. Like I talked about earlier, we really recommend one copy in electronic form. With the way the world's moving, God forbid a fire or flood, it's really a great thing to have backed up electronically for the practice. And really just want to reiterate the importance of to know that buying and owning a templated OSHA manual really may provide that false sense of security when it comes to being compliant in the event of an investigation. Right? It's really on the inside that the government's looking for. Now, another piece of the puzzle is going to be making sure that you are documenting the appropriate safety and health logs. In fact, record keeping is one of the most cited violations of OSHA standards every single year. All right. Documenting workplace incidents helps to evaluate the safety of a workplace, understand workplace hazards, and implement worker protections to reduce and eliminate hazards. While most healthcare organizations are exempt from having to actually report this data to the government on an annual basis, it's still an OSHA requirement to document any injury or illness that occurs in the facility for those OSHA record keeping forms. The records must be maintained at the worksite for at least 5 years, and each February through April, employers must post a summary of the injuries and illness recorded the previous year. Keep in mind that there are state-specific plans that come into play, so this may affect what specific logs you'll need to have in place or who you need to report incidents to when they occur. Now, safety data sheets under the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, there is a requirement for all organizations to have safety data sheets and make sure that those are readily accessible to employees. In certain professions like construction, food and beverage, having safety data sheets on hand is typically standard. Unfortunately, what we've seen, is SDSs can often be overlooked aspect of OSHA for most medical practices. Important for you to understand, and I always specify this, is the SDS must be stored by the practice for any hazard chemical used in the workplace, as well as maintained for all previously used hazardous chemicals as well. Okay, so if you stop using one, make sure that you're not taking that out of your SDS. The SDS really on the sheet itself, it must contain the composition of the hazardous chemical, the types of hazards associated with the chemical, and first aid information should there be an event containing the chemical. Now, joint responsibility. There's no requirement for vendors to sign a joint responsibility policy. However, it's best practice to have these in place in the event of an injury or illness. Also, it helps indirectly make sure that your vendors are taking their own OSHA compliance program serious. You don't want to be liable for something that happens on their end. So it really just holds them to that same standard for OSHA that you are. Now, that's really, as we went through that, that's what any comprehensive OSHA program looks like, documenting that culture of compliance is in place. We couldn't forget to mention that Arizona has an OSHA approved state plan that covers both private and state local government workplaces. Most occupational safety and health regulations in Arizona are identical to federal OSHA regulations. However, there are some regulations that are unique to Arizona. All right. Now, as we wrap up here, really asking yourself that question, are you compliant? All right, internally. And these are just some questions to consider. All right, moving forward, identifying those risks and hazards, right? Not only that, but documenting ongoing compliance, HIPPA and OSHA training, right? Making sure that HIPPA and OSHA training is on that formal basis. And then if anything has changed with regards to the state law or federal law, you'll want to make sure that that's also reflected in your documentation. The government's looking for not only that documentation to be in place, but the government wants that documentation to be specific. Okay. The last question, arguably the most important of them all, be rhetorical, but if any of these three things were to happen, an audit, investigation, data breach, or complaint tomorrow, do you feel comfortable with the documentation that you don't have? And like Juliana talked about earlier, our automated solution, that's another reason they partner with us. But I really want to take some time with regards to OSHA and just answer any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Matt. What a wealth of information. And I have so many questions that, we should have a separate meeting for. So when you're putting together the safety data sheets, and you said you have to keep everything that you have used as well as what you're using now, are you getting the safety data sheets directly from the manufacturer?
Yes, in most cases, it will be provided from the manufacturer.
Okay, so if I'm missing something that I used to use, can I still get that from wherever it was manufactured, or?
Exactly.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you. I didn't know the answer to that. So we have a couple of questions here. First one is it a requirement to have a consultant come and do on-site training at my practice? This is something that, you know, everybody does once a year. We have HIPAA and OSHA training. Somebody comes on, or we do an electronic thing, and we hope that everybody shows up for it. We all sign off that we've done it. And basically, a lot of times we know where the fire escapes are. And it's not a lot, you know. So what do you recommend? Should a consultant come and do the training? Is it better to have a great training program in-house? What's the best way to handle it?
Yeah, there's no specific requirement for a third party to come on site, but you must provide on-site training for your employees. We recommend having a checklist and having your employees sign off on that checklist. That way it's logged that there is documentation, that paper trail that the training's been completed. Our recommendation, you know, is having making sure that training, what I've seen is that training can become very repetitive. All right, so just making sure that training is completed, and then also having that documentation that it's been done.
Okay, so is there a best, you know, content list for the training?
With Abyde, we have that applicable training that the government is going to look for. Now it's kind of up to the practice on what way they deem to be the most efficient. With Abyde, we do make that easy, as you don't have to worry about what to train or when to train, just making sure that all that training is completed.
Okay, great. And then the last question that we have right now, unless somebody wants to go ahead and add something in the Q&A, is what is the time frame to log a workplace injury for federal and state required timeframes?
Great. So all employers must report to AdOsh. All workplace accidents is followed. All work-related fatalities within 8 hours following the incident, and all work-related inpatient hospitalizations, all amputations and losses of eye within 24 hours. We obviously hope, you know, this never happens, but just so you do have reporting requirements to follow, and our customer success team is always available to ArMA members, whether or not you actually are a current Abyde customer. So if there's any incidents where you need guidance or assistance, we're there to kind of walk you through that.
Okay, so sometimes somebody gets injured at work and they don't really realize it. If that happens, you know, and I find out when I went to the doctor, you know, a week later that, oh, that, you know, chemical that I splashed on my arm got in my eyes and sinuses, and that's what's causing the problem. I don't just have a bad cold. How do I report that to my employer, and how does the employer record that?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if Chris, if you, I know I have one of my colleagues on here. It's an interesting question, given the kind of the timeline of when that occurs. I'm not sure if he can hear me here. What we do have, so that can you hear? Are you there?
Yeah. So you're saying as an employee?
Yeah. So if as an employee, I splashed something on myself and I forgot all about it, but then a week later or a few days later, I find out that the reason that I've been having this cold, this sickness or whatever is because I got some of this on me. What happens then? How do we report that?
Yeah, as a practice owner, obviously you'd have to kind of rely on the employee to tell you. So it's really through the training that the employee is going to be made aware of their employee participation, right? This is all about employee participation. Once they report that, you're going to want to log it as an employer, and then depending on the severity, there's OSHA Form 300, all that, all those types of reporting forms that you need to, depending on the severity of it, log and report to the ADOSH or, of course, federal OSHA. But it's kind of a gray area in terms of you know, the time frame depending on the severity of the issue.
Okay, so does the clock kind of start when the employee lets you know that there was a problem?
Yeah, I mean, at that, right, you're kind of, it's at their discretion, right? So that's where the training comes in. Facility risk assessment, and I think, you know, Matt was leaning towards this. The facility risk assessment should kind of tell you what you're going to train your employees on, right? In a medical practice, in a psychiatry practice, let's be honest, there's not going to be a lot of chemicals. But if you're in a dental practice or some type of dermatology practice, you should be trained on what the requirements are for the SDS library. You need to have an employee portal or some type of way to give access to employees on, you know, what's recommended and what you need to report on back to your employer. But really, as you know, a company that supports independent practices, we're always going to try to protect the practice and do what's best practices for that independent environment. So it's really through the training, which with Abyde will be opened up based on how they answer questions in the facility risk assessment.
Great, great. Well, this has been great information. I really appreciate everyone's time, and unless you guys have anything else to add now, that is pretty much the end of our time today. Nothing else? All right. Well, thank you, Matt, very much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to everyone watching. For more information on compliance and how Abyde can help, I encourage you to visit both Abyde and ArMA's websites, which are linked in the description of the webinar. Additionally, you'll find contact information for our practice support department, which can help you with business aspects of your private practice. Finally, we will share a recording of this webinar in the coming days, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Juliana, if you don't mind, we do have some resources, HIPAA and OSHA checklists that we offer that can kind of help gauge the current status of the practice's compliance program, as well as some blogs. And if you want to meet with me or one of my colleagues one-on-one to kind of dissect your program and see what you're currently doing, there's a consultation link on there as well. Okay, great. And I'll actually be emailing a copy of the slides to those attending. So you'll have these QR codes. And so we can make those available for download for anyone who might be watching it recorded as well. So thank you very much, guys. Thanks again. And be sure to attend another ArMA webinar soon. Have a wonderful day.